In a world where we live in, where you can find out the package that you ordered, you can find out, who's carrying it to your house and what kind of shoes they have on and when it's going to be delivered. People now have come to expect that type of communication and that kind of information. And so I think it's so important that we live that kind of expectation for our candidates on a regular basis. Keep in touch with candidates. Don't become a stalker, but don't become a stranger.
Hello, everyone, and this is Kathleen at ClearedJobs.Net. And over the last 2 years, we've had this great podcast, Security Cleared Jobs, Who's Hiring and How. And behind the scenes, we have always asked this one question: what is your most difficult recruiting challenge? And what are the skills and tools that you use to overcome it?
It's probably been one of my favorite questions. They're my friends in arms when it comes to some of those different challenges in recruiting.
I love the fact that we're gathering this information from everyone and being able to share these best practices. So one thing that really came up a lot was candidate engagement and building and nurturing a pipeline so that you always have this talent pool. There are different strategies that people use for this. They do it in person, they do some technology, and we're really going to get into a little bit more as to what everyone does. But I remember we launched the Best Recruiter program back in 2008, where at our job fairs, we asked the job seekers who provided the best overall recruiting experience. And it was so wonderful to watch job seekers have the opportunity to share which recruiters really made them valuable and engaged. And so candidate engagement has been around for a while, and it really makes a big impact in the cleared community. Rachel, you know a lot about candidate engagement. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about what it is.
Absolutely. And I love all the words that you just shared about feeling heard and seen, because sometimes in the recruiting space, people think it's a nice to have. Oh, that's just something we'll focus on next year. We'll get better at candidate engagement in the future. But really, when you think about what it is and why it matters, it's really about that relationship building with that candidate. It's really nurturing a conversation and having open and transparent communication. It's making sure, especially in a generation where ghosting has become a real thing from so many different people, whether it's romantic or professional relationships, the ghosting is real. And so it's making sure that you're not building that kind of brand as a recruiter or as a company that you reach out and then ghost folks out there. It's really keeping them engaged and informed, especially in a world where we live in, where you can find out the package that you ordered. You can find out, who's carrying it to your house and what kind of shoes they have on and when it's going to be delivered. People now have come to expect that type of communication and that kind of information. And so I think it's so important that we live that kind of expectation for our candidates on a regular basis.
As you pointed out, Rachel, everyone sort of thinks it's a nice to have. It's something that's the icing on the cake that we'll get to eventually. But what's interesting is that word of mouth and networking is so vital to recruiting, and especially in the cleared community. Word of mouth and how you treat your employees and how your candidates does get through the grapevine. And a report by the Talent Board revealed that 81% of candidates are likely to share a good experience with their networks, but they're also 66% of them are going to share a negative experience. And we found from our own surveys of job seekers in the cleared community that 53% of them find their job through networking. So they're talking about the candidate engagement. They're talking about how they're being treated by companies. And that is important information to understand, because you may invest a lot in advertising, but if all of your candidates are learning about you through word of mouth, you want to make sure you're investing in candidate engagement.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up networking, because oftentimes people associate networking with just a really short-term goal. But this has to be an ongoing undertaking from candidates. You can't just think about it or try to pull it off of the shelf when it's time to seek that job. It has to be something that's nurtured. And likewise, our recruiters kind of have to follow that same model. We give that advice to candidates all the time, like, don't start tomorrow what you can do today. But the same is true for recruiters. We really have to be out there and start engaging talent from before they even know they were the talent that we were looking for. So candidate engagement really does have to go beyond that immediate hiring process. So Kathleen, I don't know if you remember when we were chatting with Dorion Baker of ATS, but he was talking about remaining engaged with great talent. He said the candidate might be great today, but might not be available right now. So we have to wait for another year. Recruiters oftentimes, again, we get focused on what do I need right now? And so while it's not going to meet that immediate need, it really is about nurturing it. Dorian reminded us it's that balance between remaining engaged with talent, but also not overwhelming somebody who isn't in the market today. And I think that's such an important thing to remember as we're kind of going through this. Using that applicant tracking system, it's there, friends. Use it and use it wisely. Keep in touch with candidates. Don't become a stalker, but don't become a stranger. I think there's a healthy balance between those two different matrix there. And remember, don't overdo it in such a way that the candidate now has a different impression of your brand as desperate or leave me alone, read the room. So find that healthy balance.
A recruiter that I've known impressed me. He had a spreadsheet, and every 6 months he went through absolutely everyone that he has ever talked to. There were some people he was keeping in his pipeline for over 3 or 4 years because he knew that person was very valuable, very skilled, very talented, and that he eventually would have a role for him. So he was really building his own personal brand as a recruiter and really being engaged with candidates, really understanding, meeting them at their on-site facilities, meeting them at the skiffs, understanding what was going on in the industry so that they could have really good conversations that were of value to the candidate, but also he was able to get good intel that he was able to take back to his business development team and say, hey, I heard that, something's going on down at this contract. We might want to build that into our proposal. So these simple ways of keeping engaged with candidates, keeping sort of a timeline, calendar reminders. I know on our job board, we have folders that you can build. You may have found a candidate that you don't need right now, but you know you're going to need in the future, and building sort of a communication with them. And it's interesting that understanding once you start that communication, you have to keep setting expectations. So, for instance, if you have a signed letter of intent or a contingent offer with a candidate, let them know upfront what your expectations are as far as the review of that contract and when it's going to be awarded, and understanding that they're waiting. They're waiting for updates. So don't, as Rachel was saying, don't ghost them. Be sure you have calendar reminders or some kind of reminders that say you're going to go in and let them know, hey, the contract award date has been pushed back or something has changed. This is not writing a novel. This is a little bit of information update. Hey, just want to let you know this is going on. I can't tell you how much that is going to make a difference in your engagement with your candidates. What was fascinating was one of these great stories we heard from Jen Moyers of the Mind Point Group. She shared this really fascinating story about she had a candidate that she had on a contingent offer for over a year and a half. And, she kept in touch with them, made sure that the candidate understood what was going on. She was not ghosting them. And what was fascinating is that during this entire process of engaging with this candidate ended up sending referrals to Jen. So wasn't able to use that candidate right then and there because they didn't win the task award, but she kept in touch, had a great candidate engagement. The candidate gave her some referrals. And then eventually, 2 years later, she was able to finally find a fully funded position and put that candidate in. So I know it sounds like it's a lot of work, but we all know the value of a really engaged candidate.
Absolutely. And while it might be a lot of work, it's also some of the most rewarding, but dare I say, some of the easiest work that you can do because it really ties back into the core of what recruiting is, which is about that human experience. And that's really what, to me, candidate engagement is. It's making it human, but also making it personal. In talking with Jess Mathias at Core4ce, they reminded us just of some simple, again, that human approach, but something that seemed to work very, very well at Core4ce, which was calling the candidates at every stage of the process, just making sure that it was human, not just letting an ATS talk for you or, again, falling into the trap of assumptions, assuming that they know what's going on, but really calling them at every stage of the process, making sure it was personal and not that cookie cutter approach, dear candidate type of stuff, but rather using the human name for the candidate that was going through the process and then giving them feedback on why they didn't get the job. This one can be a little touchy. I know we have to be careful and mindful of what type of feedback that we're giving, not put ourselves in a sticky spot, but in a good human spot. So sometimes the feedback may just be, hey, when you're going through an interview, you need to give specific examples. Or, don't come in and drop every 4-letter word during the interview. There may be some great nuggets that you can provide to them that'll be really, really helpful in getting the job. And I am going to give a quote, Kathleen, you might like this one. It comes from our friends, you might have heard of them, at ClearedJobs.Net. I don't know. Do you know them? Heard of them before?
I might have.
Yeah. No, I really did love this study and appreciated it, where it's kind of what do the job seekers want? So we're out there trying to assume and guess, but gosh darn it, sometimes you can just ask them. So candidates prefer email. That was the number one choice. It's kind of a safe place, right? You can get that email, you can check it when it's available for you and really have time to process and marinate it on it. Kind of a distant second request from them was that phone call. And at the bottom was the LinkedIn message. And last was text messaging. Kathleen, that one surprised me a little bit. Now we see some folks that do want text messaging. So it's always interesting just kind of how those candidates feel. So I think, again, it goes back to that personal as well. Once you've kind of built that relationship with that candidate, ask them how they prefer to be reached out to. I think that's, again, it's the most rewarding and probably the simplest thing you can do. Seek to understand and take action based on that candidate preference.
I think on the communication, so yes, on our job seeker survey, the distant second was the phone call. And I think phone call and text is a limit basically on the fact that so many people work in a skiff and they don't have access to their phone and they have their social media on their phone as well. So I think that email seems to be a lot more manageable in the cleared community, whereas phone calls, texting, and social media, that requires different equipment, different networks. And that's just my personal input on that one. But also understanding in the candidate engagement is the user experience or the ease of applying to a job. And we talk about gathering data, but we got a lot of feedback from recruiters as to gathering data is really great, but what are we putting up as barriers between the candidate and the company? So the 2023 Global Talent Acquisition Study listed 4 drivers for candidates. And the first was knowing the salary ahead of time. The second was a recruiter who makes them feel appreciated. Third was a company committed to the candidate's career development. And fourth was a fast application process. And I think it's fascinating that we think that we have really short timelines between a candidate knowing about a job and them applying. But once you realize that we have all of this data that we're trying to gather, we're putting up a whole variety of hurdles in the process. And I think that this also applies to career sites. When we were talking with Katie Sargent over at 26 Technologies, I really loved the fact that they talked about, they really spent some time on their career site saying, hey, let's make this very easy. Let them know step by step, what is the interview process? What are the onboarding processes? What are some of the career resources that they recommend that a candidate reviews before they interview? And back to the data that we sort of want to gather on the candidates, I really loved it when Toni Johnson over at GD Mission Systems really talked about how many additional clicks are you going to add to the overall application process, and to really look at our application processes not from our standpoint as to what we want to gather about the candidate, but how many hurdles or how many clicks are we putting in the way between us and the candidate wanting to apply. I know when I fill out an application for even a newsletter on my phone, if you make me click a fourth or fifth time or make something really difficult and frustrating, forget it. I'm leaving. I'm dropping out. So let's be a little bit careful about how much process we put in that. So we always need to look at this from the side of the user experience. And I know that we talked about the Candidate Experience Awards. We talked about the Best Recruiter program. And Rachel, I shared with you that graphic about the overall experience that the candidate experience journey is all about. Let's sort of like talk about it. What are the 4 or 5 steps, maybe 6 steps that they have that we should talk about?
Absolutely. I think it dovetails perfectly into what you were just talking about with the career sites, because that first step really is the attraction, that research, the branding out there. It's making sure that as candidates are able to find your organization, that it's reflective of who you are as an organization and that it's easy. It's kind of the golden rule. How would you want to apply? And so it's really about that. It's from the sourcing, when you're out there sourcing folks, making sure that your communication is in such a way that it makes sense to them.
I think that you're right. One recommendation is always go out and apply to your own sites. Go to your own job
Yeah.
board. Go to your own career site and go through the process. And we all think that we have smooth application processes, but it's not. And sometimes we put in questions and then we go, "Why did we ask that question?" So, really,
Mhm.
apply for your own jobs is one of those easy ways to streamline the overall process.
Absolutely. And then it comes to you've done the hard work. You've gone out there and built the brand. You've attracted them. They've been able to apply. You've tested your system. Does it make sense? And now it's really down to the screening and interviewing and being intentional with both of those, making sure that you're not just asking a question just for the sake of asking a question. Are the competencies tied into the job in which you're seeking for them to do? Are the questions relevant? Or are they silly? Are they going to cause people to be uncomfortable? Do your hiring managers or you, if you're performing it, feel confident asking the question? There's great resources out there through AI that can help you be more effective in this space. Making sure that you're even cognizant of how you go about scheduling the interviews. Again, I love how you called out sometimes we get in our own way. We think about it from how can we make the recruiter's life easier? But it really is about that candidate. Make sure the time zones, that's so easy to screw up. I do it on a regular basis, but being cognizant of that and making sure that when you're scheduling, it's in their time and that the hiring managers, that it all works out. So it's just paying attention to the details when it comes to screening and interviewing so they walk away with an incredible experience.
One thing that I always reflect on that I don't think a lot of people do reflect on in candidate engagement is the candidates that do not get selected.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember Jess Mathias talking about this in her interview, saying that if someone doesn't get selected, they actually gave them feedback on how they could have been selected, that maybe they needed a little bit more skills development or they needed more certificates, something like that. And it really, I think, speaks to the core values of Core4ce because they want to give back and make sure the candidates can succeed. And not everyone's going to get the job, but being able to get some constructive feedback to a candidate on how they can improve. Maybe they were just a little bit too nervous in the interview. But I think that this is also important because we have so many transitioning military personnel who are used to getting feedback. And we don't have that necessarily in our interviewing process. And we don't have that in overall companies to say, this is what you needed to do. So I really want to point out to people, don't just not select somebody, give them feedback, let them know why, and let them know that you still want them to be engaged with the company.
And I think it goes back to the topic that we've talked about, which is ghosting. You don't want to ghost them just because it's tough news. I think you can be honest, you can be fair, and you can be human through that. It's a disappointing thing for everybody. Everybody's invested time and energy and passion into the interview, and then not to be selected. Remember how it feels to be on the other side of the table. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, Kathleen, because it is something that often gets overlooked. People just kind of check it off their list. That guy's out, and move on to the next one. And that next one might be the person that got the offer. But this is also an important part of the candidate experience. Sometimes people think that the experience is just the offer, but it's about making sure that the offer is more than just, hey, here's your job. Here's what we're going to pay you. Here's when you start, but making it something that feels rewarding for them. They're excited. This should be something where you have energy. This is where you bring your A game. This is where you may have to close the deal as well, because candidates may be coming to the table and ready to counter. So I think the offer matters twofold. One, you come with your best offer. Don't come with an offer to say, I'm going to try to get them at a bargain discount rate. Come with your best offer. Make sure that you can speak intelligently to it and tell them why you landed on this offer. What was part of the conversation or part of the consideration in landing there? I think just being honest at the end of the day. If you can't move up or you can't move down, own that. Don't give them room to think that you can do something different. So really take ownership of that. Make sure you call out all of the things in the offer. It's not just the salary. The benefits matter. The time off matters. Where they're going to do the job matters. All of those things matter. So again, apply that golden rule. How would you want the offer delivered to you?
And I think that the next step in, what they were pointing out in the candidate experience journey was the onboarding. And I'm always fascinated when we talk to our clients and our guests on the show who believes they have responsibility for the onboarding. Is it the offer is accepted and you just throw them over to HR? We did have some guests who actually said that the recruiter's job was the onboarding. And not only was their job the onboarding, but to keep in touch with them throughout their career at the company so that they retained that talent. They were what we were calling re-recruiting them, making sure that if they had another position available within the company, that they were hiring internally. And I think that onboarding is something that is just such a wide differentiator among so many companies. I really loved that many of our government contractor guests really talked about mentoring, and they brought in someone else to coach them, to sort of have a buddy system. I always think of Finding Nemo and who's your exit buddy. I always like having a buddy at a conference, somebody who like is there and can get me through that process. So be sure you have your entrance buddy into a company versus your exit buddy. So what are some of the roundup of our best practices, Rachel?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. And so for those that may just kind of want to refresh and say, okay, how can I make candidate experience a thing that matters and how can we get it started? Just to kind of take it back and remind you in a simplified way, it's important, friends. It's simple. It's the way you communicate with folks. It's about that relationship building. It's not short term. You got to be there for the long game, for the candidate that may be available for that job today or the one that might be available in 2 years from now. It's about making sure that you're nurturing that relationship. It's about thinking with the end in mind. So from the way you set up your career site, the way that you set up your interview process, the way that you set up your offers, or the way you're going to treat candidates that get extended an offer or those that don't get extended an offer. All of those are important parts in the way that you do it. And again, just to kind of put a little icing on this very delicious cake out there, it can be easy. It can be personalized. And it's, again, at the core of why we're in this career to start with. It's about humans.
So thanks for joining us today. Be sure you're commenting and sharing your challenges and some of your solutions. Let's really talk about these challenges, and rather than holding all of our, secrets to our chest, the only thing we're going to do is rise everyone up and make everyone better. Thanks.
Bye.